You have wanted to change for years. You have made the decision 100 times. The decision costs nothing, which is exactly why you keep making it. Welcome to the Stoic Compass. I am Epictetus, and today I am joined by Carl Jung and Lao Tzu. Today we're examining what does it take to actually change, not just want to. Here is what I know about change. Every person who has ever failed to change was not lacking information. They were not lacking inspiration. They were not even lacking desire. They were lacking the one thing that cannot be borrowed or theorized into existence: the willingness to act differently in the specific moment when acting differently costs them something. Not in the abstract, not someday, in the moment. Right there, when the old habit is easier and the new one feels foreign and small. That is the only moment that matters. Everything else is rehearsal for a performance you never give.
I would not dismiss what you are saying, but I think you are describing the symptom and calling it the cause. You say people fail to act in the moment, but you have not asked why. Why, when a person genuinely wants to change, does something in them pull them back to the familiar? It is not weakness in any simple sense. Something in the psyche actively resists change, and it does so for reasons that are not visible on the surface. The old pattern is not just a bad habit, it is often an identity. It is a structure the person has built their sense of self around. You cannot simply decide your way out of something that is holding you together.
You are both starting from the assumption that the person who wants to change and the person who resists it are two different people in conflict. But they are the same person. The question might not be how to overpower the resistance. The question might be whether the resistance itself is pointing at something true.
That is a comfortable thought, very soothing. The resistance is pointing at something true. Meanwhile, the man keeps drinking, keeps avoiding, keeps choosing the known pain over the unfamiliar effort. At some point, the pointing has to stop and the moving has to start. You cannot wait for perfect self-understanding before you take a single step. If you could, no one would ever change anything.
But many people do take steps, repeatedly, and arrive at exactly the same place they started. That is not a failure of will. That is something more specific and more interesting. When a person cannot sustain change even when they sincerely want to, I want to know what the change would cost them at a level they are not looking at. What identity would dissolve? What relationship structure depends on them staying exactly as they are? The person who says, "I want to stop being afraid," may be someone whose entire social world is organized around their fear. Change the fear, and suddenly nothing is where it was. The psyche does not do that lightly.
That is real, but it can also become a reason to never move. There is a point where the excavation becomes its own avoidance.
Finally, something worth saying. Jung, you have just described the most sophisticated form of procrastination I have ever heard. Let me understand myself first, and then I will change. But the self you are trying to understand keeps shifting every time you look at it. You will never finish. So when does the understanding become sufficient? When does it become action?
That is a fair challenge, and I do not fully resist it. But what you call procrastination is sometimes genuine preparation. The person who acts before they understand why they keep returning to the same pattern will almost certainly repeat it. I have seen this. People who work very hard to build something new and then, under stress, dismantle it completely because the underlying structure was never examined. The change was real, the foundation was not.
Both of you keep locating the problem inside the person. Epictetus says the will is the obstacle. Jung says the psyche is the obstacle. But sometimes the question is whether the person is trying to become something that is not actually theirs to become. Not every desired change is the right change. Some changes that fail do not fail because of weakness or buried resistance. They fail because they were never aligned with what the person actually is.
Now you sound like a man telling a drowning person that water is natural. Yes, some changes are wrong for a person, granted, but you are not standing in front of someone who is confused about direction. Most people know exactly what needs to change. They are not confused about the what. They are avoiding the how, and the how is not mysterious. It is uncomfortable. It is the 10 seconds of discomfort right before you do the thing differently. That is the whole battlefield.
I do not think that is the whole battlefield. I think it is the visible part of the battlefield. Epictetus, you trust the person's stated desire as the truth of their motivation. But desire is not simple. A person can sincerely want to change and simultaneously be terrified of what they would have to become if they succeeded. Not consciously terrified, not in a way they could easily articulate. The terror is in the shadow, the part of themselves they have not integrated. That is not an obstacle you can push through with effort. That is an obstacle you have to see clearly before it releases its grip.
The shadow is real, But so is this. Sometimes seeing it clearly is not what dissolves it. Sometimes it dissolves when you stop feeding it your attention. Not all patterns require excavation. Some of them just need to be starved.
Now I agree with that, although I would say it differently. You do not need to understand why you reach for the drink. You need to not reach for it. The reaching is the only thing you control. Not the craving, not the history of the craving, the reach.
That works until it does not. For some people, the will is genuinely insufficient. The pull is too strong, too old, too organized. This is not a moral failure. It is a clinical fact. The person who has been suppressing grief for 30 years does not stop suppressing it because they decide to. The suppression is structural. It is doing something for them. The question is what?
You keep asking what the pattern is doing for the person. That is a useful question, but there is another question underneath it. What are they afraid would happen if the pattern simply stopped? Not the historical reason. The present fear. That is usually smaller than it looks.
Now we are getting somewhere, because that is a practical question. What are you afraid would happen? That is a question a person can actually sit with, not for years, for an honest 5 minutes. And usually when they answer it, they find that what they feared was not destruction. It was embarrassment, or discomfort, or looking foolish in front of someone whose opinion they have given far too much weight. That is the actual obstacle, not the psyche, not the cosmos. The fear of a specific mundane humiliation.
Sometimes, yes. But you are describing the cases where the fear is close to the surface and relatively accessible. There is another layer. There are people whose change threatens not just their self-image, but their core sense of reality, the story that makes their life coherent. For them, change is not uncomfortable, it is existentially destabilizing. And for those people, the Stoic instruction to just act differently is not wrong so much as it is incomplete. It does not address the architecture of the problem.
You are both, in different ways, making change into a project, something to be achieved, built, defended. But some of what looks like failed change is just the natural order moving slowly. Not every transformation comes when the person decides. Some of it comes when conditions shift and the person allows it. The question is whether they are oriented toward that movement or against it.
Allows it. That word makes me uneasy every time you use it. What does allowing look like from the outside? Because from the outside, it looks exactly like waiting. And I have seen what waiting produces. Nothing. Or the same thing again, wearing new clothes.
Waiting and allowing are not the same. Waiting is passive. Allowing requires you to stop doing something, to stop insisting on the form the change should take, the speed, the confirmation that it is working. That takes more discipline than forcing, not less.
I think that is actually where Lao Tzu and I converge, though we arrive there differently. What I call integration, bringing the shadow material into conscious awareness. He might call allowing the natural movement. In both cases, the change requires something other than pure willpower. It requires a different relationship to what is actually happening. The will is not useless, but it is not the whole instrument.
I will grant you this. The will, badly aimed, is worse than useless. If you are using discipline to suppress something rather than to redirect it, you are building a dam that will eventually break. I have seen that. The man who wills himself into perfect control and then at 45 loses everything in a single night. So yes, what you aim at matters. What you are actually doing when you think you are changing, that matters. But the aiming still requires a decision, and the decision still requires the moment. You still have to choose at some point with incomplete information and uncertain foundations to do the different thing.
Yes, that much is true, but the tree does not decide to grow. It grows because the conditions are right and nothing is blocking it. When change does not come, the question is not only about will, it is also about what is in the way that the person has put there themselves.
That image is useful because it asks a different question than Epictetus's. Not why won't you act, but what have you built that prevents the natural movement? That reframe matters. The obstacle is often not a failure of desire. It is something the person constructed for good reasons at an earlier time that has outlived its purpose. And the work of change, the real work, is seeing that clearly enough that you can let the structure go.
Fine, see it. And then what? You still have to let it go. And letting it go is an action. It is not automatic. Someone has to do it. Something in you has to choose. Whatever is blocking it, whatever history built it, whatever shadow it serves, at some point, a choice is made or it is not. And the choice is yours. No one else can be inside that moment with you. You have heard what is in the way. Now hear what you can actually do with that.
Most people think they are failing to change because they are weak or undisciplined. That story is almost never accurate. What is actually happening is that a part of them does not yet know it is safe to change. The old pattern, the drinking, the avoidance, the repeating argument, the familiar self-sabotage, is not random. It was built for a reason. At some point in your life, that pattern solved a problem. It protected you, or organized you, or made you legible to people whose approval you needed. It worked. The problem is that it kept working long after the original problem disappeared. And now it is running automatically, underneath your decisions, pulling you back to its shape every time you try to move. This is why pure effort fails. You are pushing against something that believes it is protecting you. You cannot overpower a protector. You have to show it that the protection is no longer needed. The way to do that is not complicated, but it is uncomfortable. You have to look directly at the pattern without trying to fix it immediately. Not with shame, not with analysis, just with honest attention. What does it feel like right before you default to the old behavior? What are you afraid would happen if you did not? Today, find one place in your life where you keep returning to the same outcome you say you do not want. Do not try to change it yet. Just write down, in plain language, what you would have to give up, or who you would have to stop being if that pattern disappeared. That answer is the beginning of the actual work, not the intention to change. The honest look at the cost.
Change is not made in the moment of decision. It is made in the moment after, the moment when the old pull comes back and you see it clearly for what it is. That is the only moment that is yours. You have been waiting for the right conditions, the right understanding, the right version of yourself. None of those are coming first. The clarity comes from the action, not before it. What you do today, with what you now know, that is the only variable in this equation you actually control. If today's conversation has served you, take it further. Pay Attention by C. Tribune, 12 Lessons in the Practice of Seeing Clearly. Available now on Amazon.